So we've been running you a little ragged, so we're going to change pace a little bit here and talk more about what's happening on the software side of things, how the model's changing, and how open source plays in the evolution of the telco industry, particularly around digital transformation. So I'd like to start with just a little definition. Digital transformation is sort of in the eye of the beholder, right? It's what you want it to be. It's not just moving from analog to digital, but in fact, it's reorienting your whole approach to be more agile, more engaged, delivering services faster at lower cost, but not just about new virtualized workloads, but how in fact you incorporate what already exists into that fabric going forward. You heard John Donovan this morning mention, as aggressive as AT&T's being, it's going to be 2020 before they're 80% virtualized. The reality is there's lots of workloads that don't lend themselves to the cloud native model, but they have to be made part of the fabric. So this is inevitable though. If you see the statistic here, 2/3 of CEOs will have a digital strategy as part of their company. This transcends industry. So for us as an industry, we want to be responsive to that. Now what's interesting is if you look at, with that definition in mind, different industries are in different places, and I'd characterize them in a couple of different ways. There are industries who have been completely disrupted. The business models have completely changed. So take retail. The advent of Amazon as a digital retailer has forced that entire industry to reform, move to digital or die for a lot of the retailers. Other industries, it's all around accelerating innovation. So look at financial services, it's more agility, delivering new solutions faster to customers, being more responsive to their partners and their customers as well. And then there are some like government or oil and gas, where the pressure is more on doing more with less. There may not be a digital entrant that's transforming the industry per se, but the pressures on budgets and costs and dealing with the complexity of existing infrastructure is pressing them to move to digital transformation, again, as a way to prepare for the future. Now, in telecommunications, it's interesting because all of the above sort of apply, right? The need to drive agility to build new services, while at the same time driving cost out of the current infrastructure and bringing that all together into a unified fabric. And you have the added challenge of competitive dynamics coming from above and below, with the public cloud providers encroaching on infrastructure, and the over-the-top vendors delivering value to customers and sort of siphoning off some revenue opportunities. So it really is incumbent that in telco we look at a digital future that's all software defined. So virtual infrastructure for providing new distribution and improved distribution, containerized microservice-based application models for constructing and delivering services faster, more flexibly, with more scalability, and the ability to deliver and collect information from any device, anywhere, from an access perspective. Now, as I mentioned before, we're moving to a software-defined, virtualized era, and it happens at all levels. So today you have traditional virtual infrastructure moving to cloud and cloud-based. At the same time, though, the application models themselves and the development paradigms have to change as well. So moving to the right, it's all about agility, rapid delivery and continuous integration of applications potentially, delivering updates to services, almost instantaneously or quite routinely. And then the nature of the applications themselves being more container-based, microservices, so you can share elements across applications, across physical boundaries as well. So containers and microservices as the basis for the new application paradigm, DevOps, continuous integration deployment as the new model, leveraging both traditional infrastructure and cloud native, both public and private. So obviously Red Hat is unique insofar as it's the only public company in the world that sells exclusively open source software. So just a little bit around open source and how it relates to what's happening in telco today. So if you look at open source, the history of open source, I go back in this industry 37 years, most of it in the open source, what we call open source today, part of the industry. In the early days, 15, 20 years ago, open source was really about creating low-cost open source replicas of traditional commercial software, operating systems, databases, middleware, and the like. But two things happened that really caused open source and collaborative development more generally to really explode over the last 2 years. One is the nature of the licensing model, which made it easier to collaborate, easier to share, and the fact that communities can accelerate innovation far more rapidly. So as we sit here today, most major new innovations in software are happening by, in open source upstream communities, and then companies like Red Hat and others productize those for mission critical enterprise consumption. Now, this is hard. And it's much harder, I think, than most people realize, because you have these upstream communities that are self-directed, they're determining their priorities, and they're all about innovation. So they do a brilliant job of driving net new innovation. What don't they do well? Well, there's a couple things that you probably gather based on their primary focus. Number one, quality assurance. They're not about fit and finish of final product. That's not their role. They're driving net new innovations. Fit and finish is left to those who choose to productize either internally or through vendor partners. So you've got issues of QA. User experience is another one. They're really about the innovation of an algorithm or a capability, not necessarily the user experience, the end user experience. And same is true for management. So what really is tricky here is how you improve on all of those dimensions and then give life cycle to those technologies, because in production environments, they're going to be there 3, 5, 10 years. Open source communities are all about the next innovation, pushing it out to their user communities, and then they're on to the next. So the notion of upgrades and life cycles for the long term is not one that's well understood in these upstream communities, nor should it be. And it's really the reason why there are companies like Red Hat that actually turn these innovations into mission-critical consumables. Now, we talked about digital transformation a bit, and most of what I'll talk about from here on out is about technology, but in fact, in most cases that we observe, technology, in fact, isn't the challenge. It's the will to move in this direction, to think about changes in your business models, who you compete with, then the process changes associated with agile development and so forth. And I think the interesting thing on this chart is the point at the bottom. And I think this is really key for how this industry evolves going forward. The open source survey that's done every year asked 2 years ago, will you be working with competitors? And now you see a majority of companies expect to be collaborating with competitors to build some of these next generation innovations. And the interesting question is determining where you want to collaborate versus where you want to compete, and where the value added opportunities lie for you as an industry. And there's a lot of work going on, right, in open source, but I think the interesting question facing this room is, where are the existential threats coming from? Are they from competitors here in the room, or are they in fact from those who represent disruptions due to their digital transformation, either the big cloud providers, the over-the-top applications, and the like? So I think there's an awful lot of work going in terms of virtual infrastructure, a lot of it being driven by open source and these communities, and I think there's a great opportunity to leverage that and then refocus your energies on delivering those next generation services faster, user experience, all the things that open source model won't help with. Let you build those solutions for end customers. The other dynamic that I think is important, and we think a lot about this because we're been an enterprise software company for almost 20 years, is what are the trends that are happening to your and our enterprise customers, and how does that read on your and our thinking around how cloud and virtual infrastructure plays out? A couple of really interesting data points here. This happens to be IDC data from just earlier this spring. So the first thing you'll notice is the vast majority of customers, on the order of 80 or 90%, expect to have a mix of public and private cloud infrastructure and workloads. And certainly from our direct engagement with customers, that's absolutely the case. We see over and over again a desire to have some workloads on the private side and some on the public side. And the second point is they anticipate using multiple external public cloud providers. For all the obvious reasons, risk of vendor lock-in. Some of these are regionally oriented. And the third is the desire for more effective management, automation, and the like. So what you see here is a roadmap for how we as an industry and an ecosystem can respond to customers that are going to be hybrid, both private and public, who are going to be multi-public cloud on the public side, obviously, and what kinds of things can we deliver to enable building those apps, scaling them, managing them, and what abstractions can we create across those to make that more effective? Well, of course, NFV is a key step in providing next generation virtual infrastructure, being driven largely out of open source through the Apache Foundation and OpenStack. We were one of the founding sponsors of the NFV working group, and we're now seeing great progress here as an industry. And I think the notion of open source being the model for innovation has already been embraced. Those of you in the room, high expectation that, for Telco and for NFV specifically, the innovation cycle is going to continue to accelerate. Your ability among peers for leveraging new thinking and collective thinking, and then for you and your customers, a wider selection of choices, because when the open source model is done right, the APIs are all open. The means by which you can pick and choose pieces is far easier. And as you all know, there's a lot of open source communities that have grown up, and to the right, more and more specifically to serve the needs of Telco with OpenStack and then other standards activities, OpenNFV, Open vSwitch, and Open Daylight for SDN as examples. Now, just one minute around sort of how Red Hat does this. So I mentioned that there's lots of complexity because upstream communities do some things well and some things less well. Well, it's our job as a vendor that's commercializing these technologies for production consumption to sort of finish the puzzle here. So some of the things that we do that are probably not obvious on the surface is, there's about 1 million open source, about 1.1 million open source projects in the world today available on the internet. That grows at about 35% annually. Of all the things we build, we probably touch maybe 1,500 of those projects. So you can see we're dealing with a vast subset of what's potentially available out there. But we have developers participating in probably another 50% more of those projects because they're relevant to what we're doing with you and other partners. So for example, we have upstream developers working in Open Daylight, an SDN. We're not productizing an SDN solution. We're doing it exclusively with partners. But it makes us smarter about what's happening in that technology and how it reads on everything else that we're doing. So what we do that's really unique, and what those of you who are using open source technologies need to keep in mind is, the first challenge is taking an upstream project and turning it into a version 1 mission critical consumable. So for us, in the case of OpenStack, that means that we have, we're historically one of the largest contributors to OpenStack upstream project, but that's not as interesting to us as is the fact that we have developers on every single OpenStack module. What that lets us do is to make judgments around what bug fixes to apply, what new features to add, what things we have to do completely differently in, say, an installation or user experience or what have you. And that gets you to version 1. A lot of companies are capable of doing that. Where this gets hard is every change that we make in that code base, we have to know a priori that that's going to be accepted back in the upstream community, because if it's not, we've created a fork. And that fork we're going to keep us on and you on in perpetuity, and it gets worse and worse and worse. So the discipline and the influence to know that any change we make is going to get pushed back upstream and accepted before we commit it to shipping product. Point number 1. Point number 2 is how we engender life cycle to these technologies. And again, we leverage the same investments where we have lots of developers in the upstream communities. And as a subsequent release, every 6 months we get a new letter release of OpenStack. Well, the release that was put in, that we shipped 2 years ago, we're still supporting. How do we do that? We have engineers, again, in every one of these projects, and they're making judgments around what bug fixes can we backport, 3 or 4 or 5 releases prior. How do we backport new feature enhancements, all those things. So, and again, it requires us to maintain this virtuous cycle of how open source is innovated. Now, one last thing, and then I want to bring up a special guest. If you look at Red Hat's infrastructure portfolio, maybe about 20 to 25% of the code that we ship was actually authored by a Red Hat employee. Note the community model. Yet, somewhere between 80 and 90% of it was probably authored by someone paid to do it. So that's the nature of the model, right? If you can figure out where to collaborate versus where to compete, you can get these very, very powerful network effects around innovation and open source technology. An interesting example is Intel. Intel and Red Hat have been partners for, since the history of open source, really. Intel, although they don't ship a Linux operating system to the marketplace, the biggest contributor, one of the biggest contributors to the Linux kernel, and has been for years. Very active in OpenStack and NFV projects specifically, and a number of other things. And I thought I'd bring up Sandra Rivera, who's the Vice President and General Manager of the Data Center Group, and also on the OP NFV board, and ask her to say a couple of things about how Intel does this. Sandra?
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks.
Good morning. As Tim just introduced me, I am responsible for Intel's network infrastructure business, which is part of the broader data center group. And the data center business at Intel is the engine that powers over 95% of the world's cloud and data center infrastructure. So what we do in the network infrastructure business, what I do, or what I'm responsible for, is to take all of that market and technology leadership from all things data center and cloud and apply that to this massive transformation that's happening in the network industry over the last decade. So what we're doing is really taking advantage of all of that server volume economics driven by data center and cloud, the virtualization benefits that come from pooling and shared infrastructure, as well as the ability to apply cloud technologies and cloud business models to a business that historically has not been on the leading edge of innovation in terms of being at the forefront of a lot of new usage models from a business perspective. So I thought I'd just spend a few minutes talking about Intel's strategy and really highlight how we are deeply aligned with Red Hat in terms of our commitment to open source and open standards. And at the heart of everything we do is technology leadership, and that's true in our CPUs, that's true in our chipsets, it's true in our Ethernet NIC technology, our acceleration capabilities, as well as some of the new innovations that we have in terms of non-volatile memory, high-performance SSDs, as well as silicon photonics. But although Intel is largely known as a silicon development company, we have a deep and long investment and dependency on software innovation. About 20,000 of our employees, in fact, are software developers. And it is really through that software innovation that we are exposing all of the innovation and differentiated capabilities in the silicon. Things like trusted execution technology, which allows you to know you have a known good system for secure boot, and also lets you do things like geotagging, so that if you have workloads and applications that really can't leave a particular country, a sovereign nation in some cases, you can have attestation that, in fact, that workload is only staying in a physical location. And all of that would be telemetry that is exposed from the silicon up through the software layer. So we take that long history of technology innovation, but we build around it a strategy for this transformation that's happening in the network that goes from open source and open standards, of course, some of the tools that we provide to the industry through reference architectures, a deep commitment to enabling a broad and healthy and vibrant ecosystem, and then through direct engagement with end users. And that really builds out this strategy that we have for how we are trying to accelerate this transformation that's happening in the network to meet the kinds of demands and the kinds of requirements that John Donovan talked about earlier today. So if we look at open source and open standards, as Tim just spoke, Intel is the largest contributor to the Linux kernel, and the number 2 spot is shared by Red Hat. So we are the number 1, number 2 contributor to the Linux kernel. But as it relates to communication service providers, business and communications networks, we are a platinum member of ODL, of OpenStack, of OPNFV, and have been driving those initiatives forward along with Etsy for a number of years. And we do know that while we can apply as much as we from the cloud and the data center infrastructure. It is not a copy-paste because there are unique requirements that are really necessary in order for us to meet the network requirements for our industry. We have the reliability requirements. We certainly have a highly regulated industry within which we work. But it is through those contributions to the open source and open standards initiatives that we build out reference architectures to enable a broad ecosystem, to really to do the pre-integration, if you will, and the optimization for different use cases like virtual CPE, virtual EPC for the core of the network, virtualized BRAS, virtualized CDN. So we integrate all of those ingredients, we optimize and characterize them, and we publish them in a set of reference architectures that really act as blueprints for the industry to be able to kind of really cut down that time that it takes to innovate. So it's the tips and tricks and techniques that shorten that development cycle for our broad ecosystem. And our ecosystem is healthy and vibrant. We launched the Intel Network Builders ecosystem in the fall of 2013, so we're almost 3 years old now. We have over 200 members. Of course, Red Hat has been a key member from the beginning, where we're trying to lower the barriers to entry and enable more participation in the market, because we deeply believe that the more participation you have in the market, the more innovation you drive in the industry. And that ecosystem now also includes end users like Verizon and BT and Telefonica and China Mobile that are also working with our ecosystem to create the requirements and drive the demand for innovative solutions. And then finally, the way that we're collaborating with end users, we have a long history of engaging, of course, with the cloud, the hyperscale cloud service providers, also with the large enterprises. But over the last several years, we've developed deep relationships with the communication service providers as well. Companies like AT&T, we are part of their foundry, as John talked about this morning, where a lot of the new innovation and new usage models are really being tested and trialed and quickly ramped and deployed. Last year, we counted over 40 commercial deployments of NFV solutions and SDN solutions in the market, and we entered this year with a funnel of over 200 more that we believe that this is the year that we start to see that ramp. It's like that flywheel that's been kind of turning for a couple of years, and this is the year that it really starts to take off. So what we see from those end-user collaborations is we learn a lot in terms of those requirements. And one of the examples I like to draw on is the fact that if you look at an enterprise environment, particularly a financial services, in the financial services industry, all of the same requirements that they have for high-performance packet processing, for high levels of security, for reliability and uptime, for high levels of capability and programmability. All of those same requirements are the requirements that an AT&T would have, a Vodafone would have, a China Mobile would have. The only real difference is in the fact that they don't have a NEB certification that they have to adhere to. So we see over time that these markets and these requirements are converging. And we draw from, again, our history of leadership and innovation in data center, in cloud infrastructure to drive this transformation that's happening in the network. And we're delighted to partner with Red Hat in that process to drive this transformation even faster. So thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. Yeah. So in just the minute or so we have left, just a couple words on how, as you heard, how Intel addresses this, what we do as well. So the first thing that we do is, we're trying to build a holistic fabric that integrates the traditional with the new, that transcends private and public clouds. And the way we do that is by optimizing our infrastructure elements for the workloads that they're serving, but be very disciplined about having common technologies across the board. A common enterprise-grade Linux operating system with Red Hat Enterprise Linux, common hypervisor that spans all the way out to our solutions in the private as well as public cloud, common container format, common orchestration, automation, cloud management, all things that let you tie this fabric together in fundamentally unique ways. And there's no other vendor that's that's done that. Now, this is a vision we had 5 years ago when we anticipated serving the cloud market generally and telco needs specifically. And what we've done is we've created levels of abstraction so that you can actually build out these hybrid cloud environments where you have a common operating system with the same workloads, virtual instances that are the same, public and private, and then our highest level of abstraction is OpenShift, which is our container management and PaaS platform. It is identical, and it's managed identically, whether it's on any public cloud or in a private cloud infrastructure. So you get much higher degrees of consistency, and we can work with you to actually leverage that in the face of some of your broader competitors. Just one last point, and specifically what we're doing in terms of the NFVI platform. There's really a couple things that our open source heritage gives us the experience to do. One is ensure that the platform itself meets your carrier grade availability requirements. And in a cloud world, this is interesting because we're doing the work to ensure there's no single points of failure, there's redundancy, there's self-healing, all that sort of comes with the close to infinite scaling that's a part of the OpenStack vision. So that's going to serve us to provide a highly available platform. And now you add the cloud native application model where the applications themselves manage some of their availability, and that's the vision that gets us to continuous availability. At the same time, we provide what I'd call military-grade security, and it's literally military-grade. We're one of the few that has government certification, a common criteria in this case, for both the virtualization layer and the operating system itself. There's a number of things that we do in integrating the operating system and the hypervisor and OpenStack with NFV to ensure security of the VMs and of the behaviors within those VMs. And as Sandra said with Intel, ecosystem's important to us. We understand our role in this world. It's to build out and productize the core infrastructure and work with many of you and your end customers to complete a complete solution. And so with that, I know we ran a couple minutes late. I want to thank you for your time. We're very honored to be a sponsor of TIA, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.